Hello, my name is Daryl Robert Schoon, and I started the last program talking about 2012 and the political process that's going on. In that program, I basically recapitulated the history of paper money, how it had first appeared in China, and the reason I did so is that it's paper money and the banking system that has really formed the context of what's going on in 2012 as we face this presidential election. I know that the issues facing you are never framed in that context. They're framed in the context of the left and the right. They're framed in the context of Republicans and Democrats. They're framed in the context of socialists or conservatives, right-wing nuts, left-wing nuts, or whatever. And I want to tell you, as true as that context is, as true as those polarities are, and they are true, there is a greater context that's going on that you are unaware of. And this is really what's at stake now. At the end of the last program, I brought you forward from the point of view of when the bankers had taken over the system in England, transferred to the United States, and ultimately, at this point in time in history, it's gone over the entire world. Now, where we are at this point is everybody is in debt. Why is everybody in debt? Because in 1694, the bankers got a franchise with the King of England, allowed them to use paper money instead of gold and silver coins, and by this device, they have indebted the entire world. If every dollar, if every issue of currency was paid off, if every debt disappeared, money would disappear. Now, I know you don't understand it, all right, but it's true. Because central banks issue money in the form of a loan, in the form of debt. Why? Because bankers make money from indebting others. It's as simple as that. Bankers make money from the indebting of others. And how they've done this is that they first indebted governments, then they indebted companies, then they indebted families, and then they indebted students. And now, why you're in trouble is that there's no one else to indebt, and everybody who's indebted can't pay their debts back. It's as simple as that. There's a limit to how much debt people can pay. And we've reached that limit. Simply as that. This is where we are in 2012. All right? And I know you think it's an issue between Democrats and Republicans. I know you think it's an issue between socialized medicine and whoever else. Well, they're there. But I want you to understand why you think this. And now we're going to go back to the people who benefited by the system of indebting others. I don't think anybody watching this program is a part of that 1%. But that 1% really does exist, and they're the ones who benefit off the system that the bankers created. Because the banker system benefits those who are closest to the fountainhead of credit. And the ones who are further away, the workers, the ones who owe money, they're the ones who ultimately bear the cost of this odorous system that the bankers have put in place where they live off and profit by the ingenuity and by the work of others. The bankers don't do anything. All they have to do is keep that system together so it keeps growing, and then as long as that money keeps going out in the form of loans, as long as the debtors pay back what they owe, the bankers can live skimming off the top. Not by working. Not by working at all. When you go to sleep at night, if you owe a debt, you owe more tomorrow than you owe today. And by the same token, if the banker has loaned you that money, and you pay that debt back, the banker's going to be richer tomorrow than he is today by doing nothing. It's as simple as that. The trouble is we've gotten to the point of where the indebted can no longer pay what they owe back. The system has reached its natural limit. This is where we are in 2012. We have three major economic zones, all right, in the world. The United States is the largest economy, except for Europe in aggregate is now larger than the United States. All right? The United States owes more money than it can ever pay back, ever, and ad infinitum. All right? Europe owes more money than it can pay back, but it owes less percentage-wise than the United States does. Japan owes even more. Japan Japan's debt per GDP is the largest in the world. So we have three major economic zones, all heavily indebted: Japan, the United States, and Europe. Why? Because they all are basically based upon that capitalist system that the bankers put into play in 1694 in England and in 1913 in the United States. The only major economic zone that is not indebted is China. All right? Why? Because China was the last one to the table of debt. China was a communist country. Well, China was neither communist nor capitalist before the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, China had a communist system. All right? Finally, went capitalist when their communist system collapsed, because communism just doesn't work. Capitalism works for a while, and ultimately it will collapse too under debt. So China was the last one to the table, and so they don't owe money like the United States does, like Europe does, and like Japan does. China is in trouble because its savings are enumerated in the IOUs of other countries. China's wealth is not in gold and silver, though they do have some. All right? China's wealth is basically enumerated in the America's IOUs to China. So we're all in this thing together, and it's all falling apart. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to see it from the standpoint of the people who own the system. All right? They are really scared. Now, I know you're scared too. I know you're worried about your jobs. I know you're worried about your savings. And I know you're worried about your kids. And you have reason to be. All right? Because you're on the bottom of this pile, of this pyramid of debt that the bankers have set together. But what I want to tell you, the people at the top of the pyramid are worried too. All right? They're worried that the pyramid can't keep going like it is. It's a pyramid game. It's a pyramid scheme. All right? It's a scam. And it's a scam dependent on the extension of credit and debt, which no longer can expand. So they're really worried. They're the 1%. And the 1% is truly worried. Now, I want to bring you attention of one person who I'm going to use now as I'm going to call him Mr. 1%. All right? He's emblematic of the 1%. Just like there's faces of the 99%, all right? But the 1%, and I want to tell you how this guy came into my consciousness, all right? When I wrote my book, How to Survive the Crisis and Prosper in the Process, in 2007, I predicted, basically in this book, that the whole U.S. economy was going to collapse. That real estate would lose 40 to 70% of its value, that stocks would ultimately lose up to 90% of the value, and the whole economy of the world was at risk, just like it was during the Great Depression, except even more so because of the monetary crisis that was basically going to happen as a result of this, that wasn't even in motion in the 1930s, and that's clearly in motion now. All right? So I write this book. I give this talk in 2007, and pretty soon everything starts happening just like I predicted. And I get a phone call from a guy with a radio program, and he wants me to talk in his program. I've never heard of this guy before. His name is Chuck Harder. And so he puts me on this program. He asks me questions. And in the middle of the first program, this is 2007, 2008, he goes, Daryl, do you know who Pete Peterson is? I go, no. He says, look him up. Look him up. And so I did. I Googled Pete Peterson. And this is what I found out. Pete Peterson, in 1973 to 1984, first of all, he graduated from the University of Chicago with a degree in business. All right? And Mr. Peterson went from the University of Chicago to New York, where he worked in an advertising company. All right? And then he went to work, he left advertising, and he became chairman of Bell and Howell. All right? And then he moved from the CEO of Bell and Howell to the chairman of Lehman Brothers, a major Wall Street financial firm. So he was, I think, CEO of Lehman Brothers from 73 to 84. And in 1985, he left Lehman's and co-founded Blackstone Partners, which is an equity firm. All right? In 2007, he basically sold part of his position in Blackstone and got a payout of $1.9 billion. That's a lot of money. All right? While chairman of Blackstone, he became chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations until he retired in 2007. And during that period, he was chairman of the New York Fed from 2000 to 2004. Well, that's who Pete Peterson is. And the reason why I knew about Peterson was Chuck Harder asked me if I knew him. And I didn't until I Googled Pete Peterson, and that's what I came up. You can do the same thing. Google Pete Peterson. Big guy. He's one of the 1%. Well, what happened is Chuck Harder told me in 1997 he had a syndicated radio program across the United States, and he was warning Americans about the financial crisis that he saw coming. All right, 1996, 1997. And Chuck Harder said, you know, Darrell, he said, I ended up on the front of the Wall Street Journal. All right? And they were making fun of me. There I was. They showed me waving an American flag and saying, this man says it's all going to fall apart. All right? He said they made a joke out of me because he was warning back then of a potential crisis of the American economy because of debt. Well, he said what happened was he got a phone call from Mr. Peterson. He said, I didn't know who Pete Peterson was either. One of the most powerful people in the United States called him up. And he said this, because he asked me, he said, you know, Mr. Harder, he said, you can find out who I am. This is who I am. And I have a question. He said, I have a concern. He said, he said, I live in a gated community. And you can imagine what kind of gated community Mr. Peterson lives in. It's not like your little strip mall of quote-unquote expensive homes where they've hired this low-cost guy or a couple people for $10 an hour to sit there and check off your names of who comes in to give you this illusory sense of security, when the real danger is the economy collapsing and your house is going to be foreclosed, and it's not going to be a robber from the other side of town that's going to come make it through, you know, by knocking over the security guard at the gate and coming and stealing your big TV and whatever else you own. It's because the economy is going to collapse and you're going to lose your house and your savings and everything you put on into it. That's what's going to happen. Pete Peterson, I'm sure, lived in a gated community that you and I can't even conceive. This is one of the richest men in America. All right? And he called up Chuck Harder and he said, listen, he said, I live a rather secure life. He says, but what I'm afraid of is all of a sudden getting a threatening letter from somebody and they've kidnapped one of my grandkids or grandchildren, great-grandchildren. I can't prevent that. And Chuck Harder said, well, and he said, what do you suggest that I do? And Chuck Harder basically said, you know, Mr. Peterson, maybe you ought to do something so people don't get mad enough, so that's what they end up doing. Well, he didn't hear from Pete Peterson after that. In fact, they had a conversation a couple of times, and Chuck Harder said after a while, whenever he called up Pete Peterson, he couldn't get through anymore. And I think it was one of those moments of reflection that the very wealthy have about their position in this world, and that they're feared that the world is going to pass by, that it's going to collapse. And it's going to. Because the world of the 1% is based upon the well-being of the 99%. And the 99% is in trouble, is in deep trouble. You know, I would sit there and I'd watch TV and, you know, I'm not really your normal happy camper. And I'd see these people say these little smug, little trite little saying, you know, our children are our future. And indeed they are. But these same people that would say that blithely would vote in politicians that bankrupted the United States basically over war. All right? Only lately have there been entitlement programs put in place to also loot the American Treasury. And now the right wing that had looted the American Treasury and bankrupted it because of war is trying to blame that the lack of money in the Treasury is based upon Medicare and Social Security. In fact, that's exactly the Peterson Institute's point of view. There's a Peterson Institute that is warning the American people that we have to balance the budget. But what they're trying to say is it's the entitlement programs that have bankrupted the country. And what I want to tell you is this, that the one percenters, like Mr. Peterson, just didn't give a damn when the United States spent all its gold between 1949 and 1971 on its military establishment around the world. That the people who call themselves physical conservatives, like Mr. Peterson, never raised a cry about the extraordinary military expenditures and the wars that the United States had all over the world. They're only blaming the entitlement programs that were put in place after 1970, 1980. Now, I'm not saying that these entitlement programs are not going to bankrupt the country. What I'm saying is there's blame to go on both sides of the table. Because what the bankers did very cleverly is they indebted Americans by letting them spend money that they didn't have, figuring that their children were going to be forced to pay it back. What the bankers didn't figure out was that the United States economy was going to collapse and these kids were going to graduate indebted up to their ears in student loans and not be able to pay it back because they can't get a job. And this is where we are now. The United States is on the verge of a financial collapse of epic proportions. Japan is on the verge of a financial collapse of epic proportions. The demographics in Japan is that this is the first year that the sales of adult diapers has exceeded the sales of infant diapers in Japan. That's what's happening in Japan. For those who are listening to what's happening in the United States, it's all too clear. This country is indebted beyond its ability to repay. Europe is unraveling now in front of our eyes. Its effect of the collapse of the European Eurozone is going to affect everyone. What is happening around the world in a different iteration, but the same thing is happening. The debt load set in motion by the bankers very successfully over 300 years ago has succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. And those who sit at the top of this apex of credit and debt, the bankers, the people like Pete Peterson, the one percenters, are so wealthy they have billions, while those at the bottom have nothing except debt. This did not happen by accident. This did not happen because the people of the 1% worked harder than the people at the bottom. This happened by design. This happened because that system of modern banking that they sold to you as capitalism, as a fair system that gave everybody a chance, wasn't that fair after all. It was a stacked deck from the very beginning, that those on the inside of the game, those who had access to credit, or those who didn't, and those who had access first, benefited. And the further away you were from that apex of credit meant you got indebted while they got the credit. This is where we are. The system is now collapsing. But I want to tell you, only by its collapse are your children going to have a chance. Only with the collapse of the present system are your children going to have a chance of living a life that they don't have today. If this system stays together as those at the top of the pile want, they are going to live in debt slavery. Now, I know all you have really wanted was a chance at the brass ring in life. And this happened for a little while as their system of credit and debt grew and grew and grew. But I want to tell you, those days are over. Those days are over. I don't care how desperately you want them to come back. I don't care how fondly you remember those days. I don't care how much you blame the other political polarity for your problems today. The 1% rules by their ability to get the 99% in line with them. And I want to tell you right now how they did it. How does the 1% indebt the 99% and stay in power in a democracy? Then 1% stays in power because they don't want the paradigm to change. Why? Because they benefit from the paradigm as it is. They benefit from the paradigm as it is. Their wealth and power depend on it. But how do they do that in a democracy where they have to go to the electorate every 4 years, every 2 years to stay in power? The reason how they do this is because of fear. Fear. The fear of change. The other 99%, they've split down the middle and they've scared the bejesus out of them. The people with the most money have scared those with the least into voting for the Republican Party time after time again because they're scared of social change. Now, you can vote for the Democrats and you're not going to get the change you want either, because ever since Clinton got elected in 1992, the Democrats are also owned by the money boys in New York. Goldman Sachs owns the Democratic Party. John Corzine, MF Global CEO, was a Democrat, and they're all corrupt. That's why when you voted Obama in, you didn't get change, though we promised it. What we wanted more than anything was change when Obama got elected in 2008. People who would never vote for a black man voted for a black man because a white man who was in the office for the last 8 years drove this country into the ground, lied to the American people, and put us in and took away every liberty that we had. It was so bad, this country voted for a black man for the first time. They voted for change. But the trouble was, the Democratic Party was in the grasp of the bankers. Just like the Republicans are owned by the bankers. Now, so what I'm saying is that here we are. We are trapped in a system owned by the bankers who control both political parties, who they've got them Americans fighting fighting with each other. It's like a family facing the biggest crisis of its life, and mom and dad are fighting a battle to the bone over each other when the house is in danger. When the house itself is in danger. My metaphor is 2011. It's early March. It's in Japan. An earthquake is going to happen on the 14th. And there's a Japanese couple. And they're thinking about what to do. And the mom says, maybe we ought to do this. And they're so angry at each other, they're not going to do anything. And in 14 days, they're thinking about maybe moving. They're thinking about maybe moving for some reason away from the coast. But that couple is so bitterly at war with each other, manipulated by the powers, the banking powers, so they think each other is the problem. They think each other is the problem why they're in today. But it's the bankers. But Americans, nah, you're locked in a battle to the death. And it's going to be your death. But I want to tell you something. There is hope. And the hope is going to come when the system that has manipulated you to the moment so successfully that you can never get on your own is itself in the verge of collapse. Better times are coming. But it's going to